Statutory interpretation. Once law has been created, it must be applied to real situations. It is impossible for Parliament to spell out how a statute should apply in every situation. It is therefore necessary for the judiciary to interpret the framework provided by Parliament and give effect to their words. This process is known as statutory interpretation. Before considering the way that judges interpret legislation, it is important to understand the many factors that can create uncertainty as to statutory meaning. These factors include the likes of drafting errors, unforeseen developments, and political uncertainty. In addition to these, uncertainty as to the interpretation of a statute can also arise where words have more than one potential meaning, the meaning of a particular word has changed over time, or the meaning of a word is derived from the context in which that word is used. The primary objective of statutory interpretation is for the courts to discover the will of and intention of Parliament. In circumstances where the meaning of a statute is unclear, a judge has a range of rules, aids, and presumptions which can assist with interpretations. The doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty asserts a hierarchy in which a parliament is positioned above the judiciary. The traditional view is that the constitutional role of the judiciary is to interpret and apply the law. It is for Parliament to make law, however it is in theory. The truth of the matter is that there is a scope in the English legal system for both judicial creativity and judicial discretion. The problem with this is that members of the judiciary are not democratically elected and accountable, and as such, they should not be making law. Other than that, the discretion judges have when interpreting statutes may reflect their own personal beliefs and prejudices. This could potentially overturn the wishes of Parliament. When it comes to how a judge should interpret statutes, there are two contrasting views. The first one, known as the literal rule, works through judges looking at the words of the legislation in order to determine meaning. The second approach, known as the purposive approach, allows for the judge to look beyond the words of the statute. When faced with ambiguity, it advocates for the meaning of words to be considered in accordance with the purpose of the statute. The UK's membership of the EU has had an impact on the interpretation of legislation. When faced with legislative ambiguity regarding EU law, a court has a range of options available in terms of the approach that it can adopt in order to establish meaning. More often than not, however, judges adopt the purposive approach. This is because EU legislation only sets out the general principles and leaves the finer details of the legislation to be determined in cases by the judiciary. The impact of doing this approach is that meaning of the legislation can be determined only on the basis of a purposive approach. The purposive approach to the interpretation of the statutes is not keeping with the traditional literal approach adopted by judges in the English legal system. However, in order to interpret EU legislation, members of the judiciary in the UK have had to adopt a purposive approach. As a direct result, the purposive approach is now being adopted more frequently in the context of the interpretation of domestic legislation. The Human Rights Act 1998 also plays a pivotal part in the process of statutory interpretation. It requires all legislation, as far as is possible, to be construed in such a way as to be compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights. The impact of this requirement is that the judiciary have much wider powers of interpretation than those afforded to them by the traditional rules of interpretation. We will now consider the three traditional approaches to statutory interpretation. You need to be comfortable with these rules and understand how the application of different rules can produce very different outcomes. The literal rule requires the judge to give the words of the statute their ordinary and natural meaning, even if the effect of the literal interpretation is to produce an unjust or undesirable result. The golden rule is considered to be an extension of the literal rule. It is applied where an application of the literal rule would result in an absurdity. The golden rule may take one of two forms. The first approach is the narrow approach. The approach is adopted when a word has potentially two different meanings. The narrow approach of the golden rule determines that priority is given to the meaning that does not produce an absurdity. The second approach is the wider approach. This approach is adopted when there is only one possible meaning of a given word, but a literal interpretation will result in an absurdity. The last traditional approach, known as the mischief rule, is the most flexible. It allows the court to consider the words of the statute in the context of mischief, but that the legislation was intended to resolve. In addition to the rules on interpretation, the judiciary may also make use of aids to interpretation. These include the likes of headings, preambles, textbooks, and more controversially, Hansard, the official record of debates and proceedings held in the Parliament. The use of Hansard as an aid to interpretation was allowed in the case of Pepper v. Hart, effectively overruling the principle in Davis v. Johnson.